Have you ever been in a situation when a seemingly small mistake ended up costing you greatly? It happened to me. I didn't even have any fucking clue that it will turn out to be like this. Trust is very important for any relationship. It takes a lot of effort to build this trust and very little to break it. I made the mistake of breaking it, and I regret that. Till this date. I, female 36, married to my husband, male 40. We have been married for 2 years. My husband is a professor in our local university. I'm an assistant professor in the same university. I joined this university 3 years back. The pay was really good, and the working hours were also less compared to my previous place of work. My husband is a senior professor in this university. He is well respected there. I met my husband in university when I was hired as an assistant professor to work under him. My husband was present during my interviews. I developed an instant crush on him. He was smart and fun. I was over the moon when I was hired to work under him as his assistant. We had to work in close proximity as our work demanded that. I used to attend his classes with him and also corrected test papers after work together. Working together worked in our favor. We used to hang out a lot with each other. One thing led to another and we started going on dates together. Our relationship started with small talks and casual jokes. We soon started having lunch together and spending more and more time with each other. The attraction was mutual, and it wasn't long before we got in a relationship with each other. After being together for a year, my husband asked me to marry him. I liked being with him. He was well respected in the college. He spoke with certain authority. All that had me really falling for him. I loved the way he cared for me. I told him yes, and we got married in a small wedding ceremony. Our married life was going well. I had moved in with him in his small bungalow. We were happy together. Our life was going great. We used to work together and then got to come home together. I was happy and content in my marriage. I felt like I had everything I ever wanted. My husband was the perfect alpha male. He was strong, confident, and charismatic. He knew what he wanted and how to get it. I admired him for his intelligence and hardworking nature. I felt like we were a perfect match, but soon I lost him. A year into our marriage, I made a small mistake that ended up costing me everything. It was a mistake that I didn't even think twice about when I made it, but the consequences that followed were unimaginable. I wish I could rectify that mistake. It all started with a new assistant professor who had joined our university. Let's call him George. George was around the same age as me. George was charming, confident, and, to be honest, very attractive. I had casually talked to him a few times before, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. However, one day, when my husband was out of town and I was working from a cafe near the university, me and George happened to bump into each other. We both ordered coffee and started chatting. The conversation was lighthearted and fun. We discussed everything from work to our personal lives. George was single and had just moved into the town. He was very easy to talk to, and before I knew it, a few hours had passed. We exchanged numbers and promised to keep in touch. I didn't think much of it at the time. I enjoyed talking to George, but I was happily married to my husband. Little did I know my small mistake of exchanging numbers with George would lead to a series of events that would turn my life upside down. Over the course of the next few weeks, George and I started texting each other. Initially, it was just casual conversations about work and our interests. But soon, our conversations became more flirtatious. I couldn't believe it at first. I was pretty sure that everyone was aware that I was married and who my husband was. George started sending me flirty texts messages which were subtle. I could have ignored it if I wanted to, but I didn't. I responded back to him in a flirty way too. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. I would text him only when my husband wasn't around, as I couldn't risk my husband finding this out. I was just having fun with texts. I didn't think I was doing anything very wrong. One day, my husband and I got into a really big fight. He wanted a baby, whereas I told him that I wasn't ready yet. We already had this discussion, and I had told him that I didn't want a baby. Having a baby came with a lot of responsibilities. I didn't think I was at that point of time where I was ready for those responsibilities. I tried to make my husband understand this, but he was too furious to listen. He said some really hurtful words to me. He told me that it was in my nature to run away from responsibilities. It made me very upset and sad. He left the house to get some space from me. I was home alone. The fight left me feeling upset and vulnerable. And that's when George messaged me, asking if I wanted to grab a drink with him. I hesitated, but the temptation was too strong, so I agreed to meet him. My husband needed his space away from me, so it was fine that I was taking my space too. I thought to myself as I texted George that I was down for meeting that night. We went to a bar far away from the university. It was on the outskirts of the town, so there were slim chances that I would run into someone who would recognize me there. The bar had an amazing atmosphere. The dim lights and soft music set the perfect mood for a night out. The drinks were flowing, and the conversation was light and fun. But then things started to get a little out of hand. I got very drunk that night. I ordered multiple shots of vodka. George was by my side throughout the night. We were flirting with each other continuously. It started to feel like we were the only two people in the world. I forgot about my fight with my husband. It was nice to be away from the stress of my marriage for a while. The chemistry between me and George was undeniable, and it was unlike anything I had ever felt before. That night, I cheated on my husband. George came out to drop me to my cab. We stood there and waited for my cab to come. We were waiting on the pavement when he kissed me. He gave me enough time and space to back out, but I didn't. I kissed him back. I was so drunk that I didn't realize anything till the next morning. I woke up with a terrible hangover the next morning. It took me some time to realize what had happened last night. My kiss with George came back to memory, and I instantly thought, fuck, what had I done? I went out of the bedroom and found my husband at the kitchen counter. He was quite calmer than yesterday. He asked me where I was last night. I told him that I went out with my friends. He nodded to that and then said sorry for our fight that happened the previous day. He told me that he'll give me as much time as I want and there's no hurry to have a baby. He just couldn't wait to grow our family. I was instantly consumed by the guilt of what I had done last night. I kissed another man when my husband was dreaming of growing our family together. It was just a kiss, but still. It was a mistake that I deeply regretted, but there was no going back now. I knew I had made a grave error in judgment, and the regret consumed me. I wanted to come clean and tell my husband, but I was too scared of his reaction. I was terrified that he might find out about my mistake and leave me. I knew him. He wasn't the type of man who would let something like this slide. I saw text messages from George when I went to my bedroom. There were texts from him the previous night asking me if I had reached home safe. There were also texts about how he really enjoyed our kiss and would like to see me again. I immediately blocked him. The guilt of not being honest with my husband weighed heavily on me every day. I loved my husband, and I knew that if he found out the truth, it would break his heart. But still, I couldn't bring myself to tell him what had happened between George and me. Every night I lay awake in bed, motionless, reliving the moment I made my mistake. The guilt and fear were heavy like a physical weight, crushing my chest. It had been weeks since that day, but I still didn't have the courage to tell my husband what I had done. My throat seemed to close up every time I tried to form the words. So I decided to keep it a secret. I tried to act normal in front of my husband for the next few weeks. But every time he touched me, every time he kissed me, I felt like a fraud. I felt like I was deceiving him. I was living a lie. I was stuck in this limbo of guilt and fear until one day, George came to the seminar conducted by my department. My husband was the speaker in this event. As soon as I saw George, my heart sank. He knew what we had done, and he could easily reveal the truth if he wanted to. Fortunately for me, he didn't say anything about that night or even acknowledge me in any way. He kept his distance throughout his time on campus, never once giving me an indication that he remembered our secret kiss from months ago. I was relieved that he hadn't said anything about us, but at the same time, my guilt only intensified even further. It felt like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off at any moment. The day finally came when everything fell apart. It was a Monday morning and I was running late for work. I had a meeting with one of my colleagues and I was already 10 minutes late. I quickly grabbed my bag and rushed out of the house. I got in my car and started driving towards the university. As I was driving, I realized that I had left my phone at home. I panicked for a moment, but I decided to keep going. I knew that I would be late for my meeting, but I didn't want to turn back and risk being even later. My husband didn't have anything scheduled for the morning. He was going to come separately before his afternoon meeting. When I finally arrived at the university, I rushed to my meeting. It was a productive meeting, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. As soon as the meeting was over, I rushed to my office. When I opened the door, I saw my husband sitting at my desk. He had my phone in his hand, and he was scrolling through my messages. I froze. I knew at that moment that everything was about to come crashing down. My small mistake had finally caught up with me. My husband looked up at me with a look of betrayal in his eyes. I felt like the biggest fool in the world. He stood up and handed me my phone. "Why did you do it?" he asked me, his voice barely above a whisper. He had scrolled through my text messages with George. He read all our text messages where he flirted with me and I flirted back. He also mentioned the kiss in the texts. I had no words to say. I knew that there was no justification for what I had done. All I could do was hang my head in shame and wait for whatever was to come. My husband told me how he knew something was wrong when I started avoiding him in the last weeks. He told me that he had thought I was still upset about the baby thing, and that's why he was giving me space. "I never thought you'd betray me like this," he said to me. My husband didn't say anything else. He simply left my office, leaving me alone with my guilt and shame. I knew that I had lost his trust, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to earn it back. I sat at my desk for what felt like hours, numb with shock and regret. I had destroyed the one thing that mattered most to me, my marriage, and all because of a stupid kiss. I went home after some time. I needed to explain to my husband that it was a mistake and that I really loved him. My husband was sitting on the couch in the living room drinking his whiskey. I went to him to hold him and explain to him what had happened, but he rejected my touch and pushed me away. His eyes were cold and distant, and I could feel the anger radiating off of him. I knew that I had hurt him deeply, and there was nothing I could do to make it right. I felt an urgent need to explain everything to him. I told him how it was just a kiss, and that happened only because I was extremely drunk. He looked at me with so much anger but didn't say anything to me. He left the house after my confession. For the next few days, my husband barely spoke to me. It was like I didn't exist. I begged him for his forgiveness, but he refused to even look at me. I felt like a ghost wandering without any purpose through our home. Days turned into weeks with my husband and I living together but barely speaking. The air between us was thick with tension and unsaid words that hung like a loaded gun. I tried to reach out to him, but he kept pushing me away, refusing to even look at me. Everything I tried went in vain. I tried to hug him while he was sleeping, but he rejected my touch. For a while, I thought that we could work things out if I just kept putting efforts to earn his forgiveness. I thought that we could talk about what had happened and find a way to move forward, but it seemed like my husband had already made up his mind about what he wanted to do. One day, he came to me and told me that he wanted to talk about something. Hope blossomed as I sat there to listen to his words. I thought that maybe he has finally forgiven me and wants to make things all right again. He immediately crushed all the hope when he asked me to leave the house. He told me that he needed some space to think about things. He said it was hard for him to think with a clear mind when I'm in the same house as him. I was devastated. I couldn't believe that it had come to this. I didn't fight his decision. A small part of me hoped that maybe if we stayed away for a while, he would miss me and everything would get back to normal. I rented a small apartment in town and moved out of our home. It was really hard for me to leave the house. I didn't pack all of my stuff as I had hoped that I was going to come back and live here with him again. I moved to the apartment. It was a lonely existence there without my husband. I spent most of my days in tears, regretting everything that had happened. Or I would try to escape everything by getting lost in my work. I had requested work from home because I was too depressed to face the world. Work was a good distraction until I lost it too. One day, I got a call from the head of my department telling me that I was immediately terminated from my job. I was stunned. It felt like everything was falling apart in my life, my marriage, my home, and now my career. I had poured my heart and soul into my work, only to have it taken away from me because of a foolish mistake. I knew that it was my husband's doing. He had always been controlling, but I never thought he would go this far. I begged and pleaded with the head of my department to reconsider, but it was no use. The head of the department explained that my husband had called and demanded that they fire me from my job. He had told them that if they didn't remove me, he would resign, and the university couldn't have that. He had used his power and influence in the university to fire me. With no job and no home, I felt lost and helpless. I didn't know what to do or where to turn. The guilt and shame of my mistake were still heavy on my heart, and now I had to deal with the consequences of my husband's revenge too. Days turned into weeks, and I struggled to make ends meet. I didn't have much savings with me either. I applied for jobs everywhere, but no one would hire me. I felt like a failure in every aspect of my life. But then something unexpected happened. George reached out to me. He had mailed me since I had blocked his contact on my phone. It wasn't hard to get my mail since George was also a professor in the university where I used to work. He told me that he had heard about what had happened, and he wanted to help me. At first, I was hesitant. After all, he was the reason why I was in this mess in the first place. I was already jobless and had a husband who hated me. I didn't know what worse could happen to me, so I thought might as well meet George and see what happens. I met George at a small cafe near my apartment. He was dressed in a smart suit and had a charming smile on his face. He offered to buy me a coffee and we sat down at a small table by the window. He listened patiently as I poured out my heart to him. I told him everything that had happened, about my husband, my job, and my life falling apart. I felt a sense of relief as I spoke, like a weight was being lifted off my chest. This was the first time I was sharing this with someone. George sat quietly for a moment after I had finished. Then he leaned forward and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I had no idea that things had gotten this bad for you." He looked into my eyes, and for a moment, I felt like I was drowning in them. There was a warmth and kindness in his gaze that I hadn't seen in a long time. It was almost comforting. "I want to help you," he said. His gesture was comforting. My husband hated me at the moment, but this man wanted to help me out. I told him that even though I appreciated his gesture, I couldn't accept it. I didn't want to make my husband more angry. Taking help from George would have done more harm than good. But as the days passed and my situation became even more desperate, I found myself thinking about George's offer more and more. I had no other options left, and he seemed genuine in his desire to help me. He had told me that he had connections in the academic world and that he could help me find a new job. My husband wasn't picking my calls. I had called him so many times to talk to him about my termination, but there was no response by his side. He was completely avoiding my existence, so I called George and told him that I had changed my mind. George helped me in finding a new job in another university. I had a hope that my life was finally getting back on track. Getting a job was the first step in making everything all right. He also helped me with my CV and cover letter. I told him that I was really grateful for his help. We weren't even friends for long, but still this guy was doing so much for me. I think that George was just trying to help me out because he also felt guilty for what had happened with me. We didn't flirt again or did anything inappropriate with each other. He was genuine in his approach to help me out in finding a job. I kept thinking about my husband and how I would have done anything to earn his forgiveness. I went to the university to talk to him, but he didn't even look at my direction and told me to leave. I was getting desperate to make him forgive me. Weeks went by and I settled into my new job. The work was challenging but rewarding, and I was slowly building a new life for myself. I tried calling my husband multiple times, but he never answered my calls or replied to my messages. I was still living alone in my small apartment with no one but George to confide in. Just as I had settled in my work, I was fired from that job as well. I had suspicion that this was my husband's doing as well. All the progress had gone to the bin, and I was back to square one. I couldn't control it anymore. I went to my husband's home and confronted him. I asked him what he wanted. He couldn't just keep taking away my work. He got livid and said that I should have thought about it before cheating on me. My husband had found out from his friends that I had gotten my new job because of George. He thought that I was having an affair with George. He told me that he hated me and that he wished he had never met me. He was in so much anger that I got scared. I tried to explain that there was nothing going on between me and George, and he was just helping me out to find a job. I swore to him but he didn't believe me. I got desperate and tried to justify the events of that night once again. I told him that I was really drunk and had way too many vodka shots. He laughed at me and told me that he cannot believe I was justifying my cheating to him. That night, I felt like I had lost my husband. The distance and coldness in his voice made it clear that he didn't want to do anything to me anymore. I had tears in my eyes when I was leaving that house. This time it seemed that I was never going to come back to this house. I kept applying for jobs at other places only to get rejected everywhere. I stopped talking to George as well. Seeing him brought back the guilt of that night when I kissed him, and it reminded me of everything that happened after that. One day when I was getting back to my apartment after another job interview, I saw an envelope waiting for me. My husband had sent me divorce papers. I couldn't stop the tears when I saw the papers. My marriage was ending because of me. It was only then that I realized that a single kiss had brought my entire world crashing down. I had never thought that a single mistake of mine could cost me my marriage and everything else. But here I was, alone, with no one to turn to for help. I didn't have many friends in town, and the ones that I had made were mutual friends with me and my husband. They were no way going to be with me and lose their friendship with him. I didn't even have my family, as they all had moved to another state because of my dad's transfer. The next few days seemed like an extremely long and painful nightmare. I went through every emotion possible, from sadness to anger, guilt to despair. I eventually stopped feeling anything at all and just knew that the only way forward was to slowly start rebuilding my life by myself. I took a deep breath and wiped away my tears. It was time to face reality and move on. I decided to sign the divorce papers. I couldn't fight for my marriage when my husband didn't want to. He had given up on me. I didn't even blame him. After all, it was me who had cheated on him. I signed the papers and went to my husband's house to give it to him. I also had to pack the rest of my stuff kept in his house. He opened the door and let me in. I gave him the papers and told him that I needed to get my stuff as well. He just nodded and made way for me to get to the bedroom. As I was going through my things, I came across a small note that my husband had left for me on our first anniversary. It read, "I love you more than anything in this world. You are my life, my soulmate, and my partner in crime. Happy anniversary, my love." The note made me cry even more. What had gone so wrong? How did we end up here? Where did all the love go? I packed as many things as I could manage and then left his house. I thought that maybe he would look at me with longing, just for a second, but nothing like that happened. There was only coldness in his eyes. After I came back to my apartment, I decided to take a break from everything and went for a walk. I walked aimlessly, lost in my thoughts. I didn't realize that I was about to get hit by a car speeding my way. A stranger had pulled me back from the road. That incident finally shook something inside me. I decided that I wasn't going to continue being a damsel in distress and was finally going to take control of my life. I left a message to my husband telling him that if he was sure about his decision, then I needed the divorce to be granted as soon as possible. He didn't reply back to me, but his lawyers contacted me and told me that the divorce proceedings won't take much time since it was an amicable divorce. They informed me of the terms mentioned in the divorce. My husband was giving me a fair share of his life earnings. I know I didn't deserve it, and neither did he want to share that with me. He was required by the law to do so. I told them to tell my husband that I didn't need his money or his assets. I needed the money even more after I lost my job, but I thought maybe this will make him forgive me. It didn't. The lawyers contacted me back, telling me that my husband had said this won't have any impact on his decision. Our divorce proceedings started soon and went as smoothly as possible. During the time we were required to be at the court, my husband didn't even look at my direction and only talked to his lawyers. His cold behavior used to hurt me so much. Our divorce was granted within 3 months by the court. I remember that I kept hope till the last moment. When the judge asked my husband if he was sure he wanted to move ahead with it, I waited for him to say no. But nothing like that happened. My husband has been relieved to lose all connections with me after the divorce, where on the other hand, I miss him every day. I wish that I could go back in time and rectify my mistake, but that is just wishful thinking. I have to spend my entire living with the guilt of destroying my relationship with my husband. After my divorce, I went out for lunch with a friend. She had called me and asked to meet since it has been very long. I wasn't very interested, but I still agreed. The friend was a mutual friend of mine and my husband. She told me that my husband has started dating again. As soon as the words slipped from her, she realized what she had told me and then completely changed the topic. I couldn't believe her words. I accepted that I had made a very big mistake, but I really loved my husband and didn't even think about moving on. And he moved on so easily. I asked more about him, but she didn't tell me anything after that. I have no one to blame for my situation but myself. If I hadn't made that foolish mistake, I would still be at home with my husband. I cannot change what has already happened, and now I'm just trying to adapt to the changes now. I knew I couldn't keep running into my husband or see him with another woman. I thought the best way to escape this pain is to get away from this town. Noon was going to give me a job here anyway, especially now when everyone knew about my divorce. I found a job in another town nearby. It was very less salary than what I used to get working with my husband, but I had no other option, so I accepted it and moved to that town. My presence didn't matter to anyone in this town either way. I'm just trying to get by each day at the moment. Some days it feels too difficult. I'm thinking of saving some money and joining therapy sessions. Maybe that would help with the guilt I carry inside me. Please let me know what you guys think. Thank you for reading my story so far. It felt good to share this with all you people here on Reddit. Update. For everyone asking me how I am doing now, thank you for asking. If I'm being honest, I don't know if I'm okay or not. It's still hard to process everything that has happened, but I just try to not think about it too much. Every time I think about the last few months, I have a breakdown. I'm just hoping it gets better with time. And for the comments which asked if either me or my husband tried to contact each other after the divorce, I did try to reach him, but he has blocked my number and on other social media platforms. I have mailed him telling him that I'm sorry, and I hoped that he would talk to me again. But like I expected, there has been no reply from him. Update. It has been more than a year since my last update. Everything has changed quite a lot since then. I thought that I was finally moving on with life. My breakdowns had decreased. I was going to therapy sessions as well. I haven't been fired from my job, which was as good as it could get. In the last year, I had tried to contact my ex-husband on multiple occasions. He hadn't talked to me even once. I wished him on his birthday via mail. The day of our anniversary was really hard for me. I couldn't help but reach him out. He never responded to any of my mails. I was still blocked on his phone. I knew he was dating someone, as my friend told me. I thought he was able to forgive me by now, and will at least talk to me. It would have been enough for me if just talked to me, but nothing. I had finally left all hopes and was trying to move on with my life as well. Just as I was trying to move forward, I was brought 4 steps backward. Last month, I had to go to the town where my husband lives for some document verification purposes. I needed his signature on some documents. I tried to reach him through email about this, but he didn't reply. I thought of going there by myself. Maybe a small part of me was just looking for some excuse to see him again. I was really anxious about meeting him after such a long time. I went to his house and rang the doorbell. I didn't know what to expect, but I surely didn't expect what I saw. A woman opened the door. She was quite young. She was also prettier than me. I knew that he was dating someone shortly after divorce, so I should have gone prepared. However, I wasn't prepared to see that woman pregnant. Her belly was showing clearly. She must have been around 5 months pregnant. It hurted me a lot to see another woman in his house pregnant with his child. I immediately got the thoughts as to how it should have been me having his child. We had a fight about having a baby when I went out that night with George. Guilt hit me hard as I stood there. I started getting thoughts as to how we wouldn't have gone this apart if we had a child to connect us with each other. I tried to compose myself. I told myself that I couldn't cry in my ex's house in front of the woman pregnant with his child. I told that woman who I was and that I needed his signature. She recognized me and told me that he's out and that to leave the paper with her. She'll courier them to me. She was kicking me out from the house, which used to be mine earlier. I nodded and gave her my address. I left that house with tears in my eyes and then came back to my apartment. I started having breakdowns again after that day. I started getting dreams about him with that woman and their child. I scheduled a session with my therapist, but even that didn't help. I have realized that I cannot escape this guilt and regret. It will always accompany me. I'm sharing this here because it feels to share my story without having someone judging me. If any of you knows something to do which will make this easier, please share with me. I'm willing to try anything at this point.